So now we're going to talk about yoga and adverse effects. We're going to go over the 10 different types of injuries, the 10 top injuries, I guess, that people report in yoga practice and how to prevent them. And so we're going to start with the wrists. And for the wrists, the prevention strategy for those injuries are to make sure that the weight that's placed on the wrist is evenly distributed. You want to make sure that your hands are spread wide when they're in use, and that we're pressing through the fingers as opposed to bearing all of that weight directly onto the wrist. For the shoulders, you want to make sure that you are letting go. You're not scrunching your shoulders up like this, but that you are making sure that your shoulders are away from your ears, so that you're not creating any issues with the strength of your shoulders by scrunching them up like this. Keeping them nice and sturdy and lengthened away from your ears is going to ensure that all of those muscles are engaged. The next one is the elbows. And for elbows, the most important thing is that when you're bending them in a pose like chaturanga or plank position, that you're keeping your elbows tucked in to your rib cage. So you don't want to go into these types of poses with your elbows sprayed out. You want to make sure that they're tucked into the rib cage, and that the creases of your elbows are facing forward. The next pose, or not the next pose, but the next area of the body is the lower back. And so with the lower back, excuse me, the most important thing is to avoid rounding your spine. When you round your spine, you're forcing your back to go into a position that it doesn't naturally bend in. And so when doing certain yoga poses like forward fold, downward facing dog, you want to make sure that you are lengthening through the spine and that you're keeping your back flat, as opposed to rounding it in those poses. And that will help to avoid a lot of the reported back pain. The next one is the hamstrings. And for the hamstrings, you just have to go slowly and really work at your own pace. Especially if you're someone who sits a lot all day, you're going to naturally have tight hips, tight hamstrings. Some ways that we can prevent injuries in the hamstrings is by really warming up into the poses, making sure that we're not hyperextending in the legs, practicing certain poses like downward facing dog, and doing some pedals with the foot before moving into some of the more advanced poses. Warrior One is another one that's a really good stretch for the hamstrings, as well as crescent lunge. So in the sequencing, those are some ways where you can warm up the hamstrings before going into a more advanced posture that may require a little bit more of a stretch. And then we have the hips. And what's really important about the hips is that you want to make sure that your toes are pointed in whatever direction your hips are squared off in. So you want to keep your hips squared. You want to be aware of what your hips are doing. And you want to make sure that your toes are pointing in the same direction that your hips are squaring off in. That's a lot of like the warrior poses tend to have a lot of different angles with the hip, and so it's important that your feet are matching whichever angle you're in. And the last one are the knees. And for knees, that's been a big one for me. Perhaps wearing some sort of knee pads, knee protection if you have issues with your knees, but also using a block or a rolled up blanket under your knees, particularly when you're in cross-legged position, maybe even like a butterfly stretch or bound angle, keeping blocks underneath your knees so that you are avoiding straining them. So those are our poses or our body parts that cause some concern. And now I am going to walk through teaching a pose or a posture that could cause some problems if not done correctly. So, I am going to be teaching. I'm going to be teaching. Let's do chaturanga. So, for chaturanga, again, I want to make sure that the elbows are facing forward in the creases. So, and then we also want to make sure that they are going to be close to the rib cage when we go down. Alright, so we're going to come into our plank position. We're going to go chaturanga dandasana. And as you can see, my shoulders are tucked in, my elbows are tucked in. And even if we were to go into baby cobra, I'm going to make sure that my elbows are tucked into my rib cage, not flowing out like this, but that they're tucked into my rib cage. And then we can even push up here into the rib cage and push it back into downward facing dog. And this is even a good place to talk about loosening up those hamstrings. So instead of forcing your downward facing dog, if you're feeling a little tightness in the hamstrings, go ahead and pedal it out. And this is a good way to warm up the hamstrings at the beginning of the practice so that perhaps at the end of the practice, you will be able to go into a full downward facing dog. All right. Thanks for watching.